Have you ever heard of fourth phase water? In this week's episode, I talked to Dr. Stephen Hussey about the role of fourth phase water in energizing our blood, which he describes in his book, Understanding the Heart, and what we can do to help keep this fourth phase water energized in our cells. Thank you for joining me today for another episode of Hunger Hunt Feast. With me is Dr. Stephen Hussey. Stephen, thank you for joining me again. It's your second time on.
Yeah.
Appreciate it. Appreciate you coming back.
Yeah,
With the
yeah.
good, with the we as we talked about before, with your book coming out, your second book, Understanding the Heart. Thanks for coming back to kind of unpack that because it's some really um, good stuff that a lot of people don't even have any clue people are looking into or studying. I think.
Yeah. No, I'm excited about this book and some of the ideas in it. Um, I really just hope to broaden the conversation about heart health and heart disease because it's too narrowly focused on, cholesterol and saturated fat, and that's not the cause of heart disease. There's so many other things we should be paying attention to. That's really the purpose of this book. Yeah.
Absolutely, yes. The focus on heart disease, and it was your own personal kind of need or exploration because of you being a type 1 diabetic. You have a higher risk of heart disease, correct? That was your.
Correct. Yeah, yeah. So that's kind of been what's driving this
Mhm.
this need for knowledge on heart disease on my part. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Well, that's great. I think, yeah, you are. We'll get into this because I'm going to let you lead because it is beyond a lot of what I've ever seen on the heart. We're always talking about macronutrients and fats and different types of fats, which are definitely play a role if we're looking at the correct fats, not saturated fat and cholesterol. If we're looking at vegetable oils and omega sixes and things like that. But what you're talking about is something not many people have heard of, which is fourth phase water or easy water and the way it gets into the heart. So I'm gonna hand it off to you and let
Yeah.
you introduce that properly and how that impacts and what the role that plays
Yeah. Yeah.
in our
Um,
circulation.
so, yeah, so last time I think we talked, more about the fats and cholesterol and that kind of stuff. And I think we talk about like, how a heart attack could potentially happen without a blockage. We,
Yes.
we may have talked about that. Yeah. And so that's kind of one small aspect of the book. And then another small aspect is this idea um, that we don't really understand what the function of the heart in the body is. Everybody, assumes or has been told that it is this pressure propulsion pump that, sucks in blood from the veins and forcefully pumps it throughout the rest of the body. And it turns out there's quite a bit of evidence that that is not what the heart does, or at least evidence that calls into question that mechanism of what the heart is doing. And so yeah, I've looked a lot into a lot of different kind of aspects of science, and one of those is the effects of what's called fourth phase water in the body, and it kind of leads us to what I think, and what other scientists and doctors have kind of come to the conclusion of, is that what the heart actually is and what its purpose is. And so to truly understand that, we have to kind of talk about this fourth phase water first. And so um, we've all been told that there's four or three phases of water, but there's actually this fourth phase, and water has these unique properties, unique to liquids, unique to water as among liquids, that it can hold energy, and it can harvest the energy or hold the energy from the environment that it gets. And so this is um, largely based on the work of Dr. Gilbert Lang and now more currently Dr. Gerald Pollack, who's at the University of Washington. And they've done all kinds of experiments in their labs, and they've shown that this phenomenon with water happens all over nature, and humans are part of nature, and so it happens in us as well. And so um, we're taught that there's solid, liquid, and gas as far as states of water, but there's actually this fourth phase that's between a solid and a liquid. So it's kind of like a gel. Think Jello. And that's actually what Jello is it's water in this fourth phase state. And so what happens is that if water holds enough energy, and this energy can come from the sun, it can come from the earth, like through grounding, it can come from other humans, it can come from eating fresh food, it can come from a lot of different places. This energy that water can hold. And when the water is sufficiently energized or has enough energy, then when it gets next to a hydrophilic surface, so a water-loving surface, then it actually starts to structure itself in a way that creates this gel. And so this has been shown. They've now proven that it forms on the lining of arteries.
Mm.
And so it kind of plays two roles there. One of them is that it protects the arteries, because another name for this fourth phase water is exclusion zone water, because when it forms, it excludes anything that's not it, aside from very small hydrated ions like minerals and things. So we're talking about, like, it would be impossible for a LDL molecule to penetrate this fourth phase water lining the arteries if the fourth phase water was healthy, right?
Mm.
Um,
Gotcha.
so
Okay.
it couldn't do it.
Because it's hydrophobic. The
Well,
LDL is hydrophobic. Well, no, actually, it's
because of the way the water structures itself,
uh
it kind of organizes itself into these planar. I think of like a kind of like a fence panel, um,
okay.
kind of like that, and they don't quite line up. They kind of offset each other, so that the spaces between them are very very small. Like they're not. So if you think about like this hexagonal ring, and there's another one that's kind of offset from it, so it's kind of looking like this, you know. And so the space is
Ah,
so small that nothing can really get into it except for these very small hydrated ions. And I talk about, which hydrated ions can get through and which can't, and why that's important. Um, but yeah, so it kind of excludes everything that's not it. So if we have this intact fourth phase water on the lining of our arteries, it can help protect them
okay.
against, damage to the lining of the artery, which is kind of initiates the process of forming atherosclerosis. Um, And so that's one thing. The other important thing that this fourth phase water can do is that because of the way it forms, and because when it forms, the oxygen and one of the hydrogens in water is cleaved off and starts to form, or starts to team up with the other oxygen and hydrogens, and they make these hexagonal rings, and that's what forms it. And then the other hydrogen that's left over gets kept out in the blood. And so we create this energy gradient where there's a very negative and a very positive space, and that energy gradient actually creates flow of fluid. And so they've done this over and over again with water. They'll energize water and put a hydrophilic, or a tube made of a hydrophilic substance, into the
Mhm.
water, and the water just begins to flow with no energy source, no pump, no anything like that, just the energized water and the tube. And so, and then they've actually shown that this happens in animals. And the one researcher in Dr. Pollock's lab has shown this successfully with chick embryos. He showed that this
Mm.
this mechanism is what happens and what keeps the blood flowing when he stopped the heart of the chick embryo. So the blood continues to flow even after the heart stops pumping, as long as
Wow.
they provide energy to the system, to the water. And there was some, back in the 60s, the 40s, and then repeated in the 60s, there was some studies where researchers found that when they stopped the heart of a dog, sorry to all the dog lovers out there, but when they stopped the heart of a dog, that the blood continued to flow for up to 2 hours after the
Mm.
heart stopped pumping. And so clearly, there's another mechanism by which the blood is flowing. The dog wasn't breathing, so the lungs weren't moving, so that wasn't helping. The dog wasn't moving, so the muscles weren't pumping any blood. The blood just continued to move on its own. And so this fourth phase water formation helps explain why that is, because when we have sufficient energy to the system and the fourth phase water forms the lining of the arteries, that's what creates blood flow. And so, and there's research to suggest that the heart is very inefficient if we look at it as a pressure propulsion pump, as this thing that forcefully pumps blood around the body. It's only about 30% efficient. And so, whether you believe we evolved or we were created, I highly doubt that a God would create something, or evolution would create something that that was only 30% efficient at its job. And so if we think about that, the job of the heart is not really to move the blood around the body.
You
It's
say
to
it's only
help
30% proficient. Can you help us
efficient,
understand what you efficient, excuse me.
right?
Um, Help us explain what you mean by that.
So based on, so in this study in particular, based on the amount of energy that was being excreted by heart muscles
Okay.
and the amount of fluid that was being moved through the heart, if you look at those two things, it was only 30% efficient. So basically, the heart was expending way more energy to get not that much flow or not that much, I guess, pumping, because it's not really a pump. It's not really a pressure propulsion pump. And so,
Hmm.
because they're looking at it in the wrong way, it's not that it's not efficient; it's that they're looking at it the wrong thing, as the wrong thing. Does that make sense?
Yes. So as a pump, it's not efficient. If you look at
Right.
it with with the correct framework, then you have
Right.
a better understanding of
Yeah.
what
Well,
its
yeah. If
purpose
we look
is.
at it at the correct role, the correct job
Correct
of the
role.
heart,
Hmm.
and so that leads us to start thinking, well, if the blood's moving on its own, and there's other mechanisms that the blood moves to, like when we breathe and also when we move our muscles, all that stuff helps blood flow. And the heart does do a very small amount of pumping, but it's only really enough to kind of move the blood through the heart, not pump it all over the body. And so then the question is, well, why is the heart there? And what's the purpose of it, right? And so one of the purposes of the heart is that it's so another way that in Dr. Pollock's lab that they found that you can energize water is vortexing it or spiraling it in the presence of oxygen. Okay, and so spiraling. Think of like think of like if you're looking at a stream and the water flows past a rock, and on the other side of the rock it kind of swirls. That's what you think of like vortexing, spiraling. Okay, or like one of those 2 liter bottles that had water in it, and you could swirl it like that, and it would go down to the other 2 liter, like that kind of swirling, right? And so the blood is about half water, and it's oxygenated. Even when it's in the veins, it's still got oxygen with it, just less so than when it's in the arteries. And so if you look at the way the heart is oriented, the muscles of it are wound in a spiral. And even the very inner layer, there's a thin layer of muscles that is in a spiral nature. And so when the heart contracts, you can see it doing this spiraling, right?
Hmm.
And so that is what's happening. So there's lots of different instances where the blood going through the heart gets spiraled. When it flows past the valves and goes on the other side, it spirals on the inside, just like water flowing past a rock in a stream. And then when the ventricles contract to move the blood, they do so in a spiral nature, which also spirals the blood. And then when it flows out of the valves leaving the ventricle, it also spirals a little bit too. And so one of one of the roles of the heart is to vortex this blood to help energize it in the presence of oxygen, so that when it does get to those arteries and veins, it can form that fourth phase water better, um, and keep the
Hmm.
blood moving. So in a way, the heart is kind of responsible for the movement of blood, but not in the way that we thought. Does that make sense?
Not as a pump, but as a directional sort of
As it's energizing the water, so that when
energizing the
it gets
water.
to in the veins, then or the arteries in the veins, then it can maintain this fourth phase water, so that it can keep the blood moving. But
Okay.
we can also get energy from outside the body, from infrared light to grounding to contact with other humans, all kinds of stuff.
So when you say energize the blood, is it as simple as a physical engagement of the way it's moving it, or it's not a chemical reaction? Then it's not a chemical additive. It's this movement of, like you said, the twisting that energizes it.
Yes, yeah. I mean, as far as the exact physics of it, that's a
Right.
question for Dr. Pollock, and he's got a book called The Fourth Phase of Water that helps explain that.
Okay.
But yeah, water has this unique ability to hold energy, which many other fluids don't have. Something about the molecules in water, the way it's structured, it can hold this energy,
Hmm.
but only when it has sufficient energy stored in it can it form this fourth phase water next to a hydrophilic surface. If you just put water next to a hydrophilic surface and no energy source, or the water wasn't energized to begin with, it wouldn't do it, or wouldn't do it as well. Um,
Okay. And the energizing, then, as you explained before, was is this positive and negative polarity, correct? Where they're pushing away from each other. Is that
Not necessarily. The energizing
okay?
is just something the water has. It just has the energy.
Hmm.
Now,
Okay.
when it has the energy, when it gets next to a hydrophilic surface, then the water structures itself. And the process of that
Okay.
structuring happening is what creates the negative and positive energy balance that drives flow. Um, kind of
Gotcha.
like, if we put all the like if we created like fourth phase water when it forms is a very negative environment because or electronegative environment because if we have water, an oxygen and two hydrogens, the oxygen and one of the hydrogens stays together and it gets cleaved off, and then a bunch of other oxygens and hydrogens from water team up and they make these hexagonal rings that kind of bind up and make these things, and those rings line themselves into a planar structure, and then those planes stack each other on top of each other next to the hydrophilic surface.
Hmm.
And so those other hydrogens that were cleaved off and separated from there, they're very positive because hydrogen's positive.
Right.
And then the oxygen and hydrogen are very negative because oxygen's a bigger molecule and it's more negative.
It
Um,
needs another hydrogen to balance out its the negative ion, essentially.
right, yeah. And so when it cleaves off like that, you get this fourth phase water that's very negative because the oxygens are so big and they're a negative, they have a negative charge.
Hmm.
And so then those hydrogens that are more positive, they get all left into the lumen of the artery or the vein, the middle of it. And so when we get a lot of those accumulated, positive or like charges repel each other,
Hmm.
and so they start trying to get away, and they start moving,
That
right?
keeps it moving.
Right,
Okay.
and so it flows. That's one of the ways. And so once it starts going one direction, it doesn't really stop. Like it doesn't change direction all of a sudden because they're all moving and trying to get away, so they just keep moving, right?
Right.
And so when they did the experiments, they put the hydrophilic tube into the water that was energized. It started forming on the lining of the hydrophilic tube, and the water just started flowing. And once it started flowing, it would never stop as long as they kept applying, an energy source to the water.
And what was give us? Could you tell us what that energy source would be in a tube where you don't, outside of a human body, we have a tube. What did they use? I mean,
They
was it a
used
physical
infrared
pump? Or they
infrared
used
light.
infrared light?
Yeah, yeah,
That's all they needed was infrared light.
yeah. And so they found that
Wow.
you know uh, the energy most absorbed by water is infrared light at the 3,000 nanometer wavelength. Um, that's what they found. I mean, there's other things. Obviously, different sorts of light or different wavelengths of infrared. You could also
Sure.
your body could also gain those, but the most absorbed by water was the 3,000 nanometer wavelengths of infrared light.
Which we can also receive from the sun with proper sun exposure,
Exactly, exactly.
theoretically, or
That's the original source of this
uh
infrared light that energizes the body. But like I
stimulating
said,
mitochondria and that kind of thing. For
yeah,
okay.
yeah, but like I said, also grounding.
Mhm.
Being in contact with the earth will energize the body, or being in contact with humans. We all have electromagnetic fields, and human electromagnetic fields like each other.
So
Whereas other
physical
electromagnetic
touch.
fields,
You're talking about
yeah,
physical touch,
yeah, or just
not just
being.
being like
You could be close, like
okay.
you and I are way too far apart right now, but
Digitally, yeah.
yeah, yeah,
I
but
mean,
but yeah,
yeah,
actually being physically close to people,
yeah.
because our electromagnetic fields are bigger. But yeah, touch is definitely the best way. Human contact is very important.
So like
And
getting a
so
massage, for instance,
yeah,
or
yeah,
just cuddling with a loved one on the couch, or
definitely.
snuggling with your kid, or something like that. But I
Hmm.
mean, let's think about. I'm just going back to how we would live. Well, even we can even go back how we lived over a year and a half ago. But I mean,
Yeah.
200 years ago, with just more sun exposure, more
Hmm.
contact with the ground, in many cases, more physical touch to some degree, but certainly more contact with sun and earth.
Hmm.
I mean, more things that energized us
Exactly.
um, naturally without even trying to do it. Now we're
Right.
in the condition we're in, especially with the current state of things. We're having to seek out these things for our health, not realizing maybe some of the great benefits of it. But we're all looking for like, how do I get more sun? How do I get outside more? How do I get in contact with more people?
Hmm.
Wow.
Yeah. Yeah. Definitely. And it doesn't even stop there. I mean, so that's one thing that the heart does is it vortexes this
Hmm.
um, our blood, which is half water, about half water, a little bit less than half water, um, and uh, and that energizes keeps it energized so that it can form fourth phase water, keep the blood flowing, protect the arteries, that kind of stuff. But yeah, I mean, if you think about it, so we're all told that we are 70% water. There's estimates from like 65 to 75%
Right.
water, right? And so we assume that there's a bunch of liquid in us, but I don't slosh around like a waterbed. I don't know
Right.
about you, but I don't. And so
No,
that's
I try not to
because
slosh.
yeah, that's because the majority of the water in my body is in the fourth phase in the gel state. And so
Ah,
in the blood, it's pretty liquid. It's a liquid state, or in the lymphatic tissue, or the cerebral spinal fluid. Like that's liquid, but on the surfaces, it can form fourth phase water. There, but in our cells, it is a gel state. So I mean, if you grab the tissue of your forearm right there, that's not liquid, that's gel. It gives just like jello and it pops right back, right?
right.
So it's very important for cellular health too. And I have a chapter in the book about how the heart it seems to evade cancer, and that's very relevant to that kind of thing. But so yeah, the effects
Interesting.
of fourth phase water on the body are huge, and you know
Wait, how do you brush over that like that, Stephen?
what
You've been at this too closely. You just dropped a bomb. Every organ in our body gets as people get cancer in every organ of our body. But who's ever heard of heart cancer?
right,
We get
yeah,
lung cancer, liver cancer, pancreatic cancer, intestinal cancer, brain cancer. No one gets heart cancer.
right. It's interesting, and I think there's two reasons why it's very rare, because it is a thing. It does happen, but it's very rare. So like I mean, we have no such thing as a cardiac oncologist.
No.
There's no job for that. And there's one guy that I've read about that is the closest thing we have to it, and he's like a heart surgeon that gets referred heart cancer cases, and he only gets like maybe 12 a year. Um, and he's like the specialist, like the guy that people to go to. So it is a thing, but it's extremely rare, and it's also very very rare for heart cancer to originate in the heart, to have a primary tumor in the heart. Most of the time, when heart cancer happens, is because it metastasized from somewhere else.
That would be my assumption. Yeah.
Yeah,
Wow.
yeah, and so what is it about the heart that kind of makes it resistant to cancer? And so I looked into this a little bit, and I think that it's twofold. One is I think that people talk about. If you're familiar with like Thomas Seyfried, Dr. Thomas Seyfried,
Yeah.
and the metabolic theory of cancer, and Otto Warburg, and all that stuff,
Right.
and how the Warburg effect and everything, and how going from oxidative phosphorylation to fermentation is what seems to be the link where cancer happens. Like if you go from oxidative phosphorylation into lactic acid fermentation, that's characteristic of heart cancer. And so if you're burning ketones and fatty acids, those are fuels that cannot be burned through fermentation, and so they have to use oxidative phosphorylation. And so they kind of help us, ward off cancer. That's the theory, anyways. Because we're using fuels that cannot be used by cancer cells. That is encouraging the cells to not become cancerous, right?
Correct.
And
Wow.
you look at
They're
the
not using
heart,
they're not using glycolytic me- metabolism. They're using the ketones and the
right,
oxygen.
right,
Yeah.
because those are fuels that can only be used by the cell through oxidative phosphorylation, which cancer cells don't use. They can't use that. They use fermentation,
Right.
which
Which
is
is basic.
why,
Just to simplify that, that's sugar,
yeah,
glucose.
yeah, which is why when you're trying to detect cancer in the body, you have people eat glucose, and you take a DEXA scan to see where the glucose is being used,
Right.
because that's the
Predominant
only
more so than anywhere else. There's a
right. Yeah,
there's
there's a hot
activity.
spot. Yeah,
The
there's a
hot
hot
spot.
spot
Right.
there, and you can see that on a DEXA scan. So yeah, um, So the thing that relates to the heart there is that the heart, um, from everything that I can find, seems to have this huge preference for fatty acids and ketones.
Mm,
And even in the presence of glucose, like usually there's an oxidative priority, and your tissues will burn, alcohol first if it's present, and then glucose, and then exogenous ketones if you're taking those, but then proteins and then fats, right? Fats is last, and so to get on like on a ketogenic state, you have to restrict other sources of energy so that your body's kind of forced to burn fat. But that's not really the case for the heart, as far as I can tell. Research suggests that even in the presence of glucose, if you put ketones in there, the heart chooses the ketones to burn,
hmm.
which would keep it in oxidative phosphorylation and away
Right.
from fermentation, right?
Yeah.
Which would suggest that that would give it some protective effect against cancer, um, if the metabolic theory of cancer is right. So, these are all, a big string of theories about this information, but, you look at it clinically and it kind of makes sense too.
Hmm.
So there's that aspect of it. And the other aspect of what I think protects the heart from cancer is the fact that our cells are filled with fourth phase water. And so how they do that is that the cytoplasm, which is, water, more or less,
Yeah.
um, is uh, is in there in the cells, and within that cytoplasm, there's this structure of proteins, kind of this endoskeleton type thing of the cell, and those proteins are very hydrophilic. Um, and
Hmm.
so, and there's this really fascinating research where they look at the cells, and they found that I can't remember the exact. I want to say it was like within 5 nanometers. Like there's no amount of cytoplasm in the cell that's not within 5 nanometers of proteins,
Wow.
those endoskeleton proteins. And so if we've got energy to the system and we've got an intact endoskeleton, um, and then we form fourth phase water, this gel, um, and that's what our cells are. They're this gel,
Hmm.
and so that what that means is that there's a few things that so we'll take Jello for an example. So Jello, to make Jello, you need the proteins, which is why there's like some collagen,
Collagen. Yeah.
yeah, in the Jello, or gelatin. There's gelatin there, in the Jello, and then you need an energy source. You need the energy source to um, unfold those proteins. Okay, and so in Jello, that's heat. You heat up the Jello, right? You put it
Right.
in the pot. You heat it up in the water, and then you put it in a pot. And as it cools, those proteins are denatured. So that when they're denatured, they're creating more surface area. So the more surface area,
Mm.
because if you just put them in there and they're all bound up like this, then the water is not going to have contact to it. But if you unfold them and they have all the surface area, now the water has contact to all this surface area, this hydrophilic surface, and then as it cools, it forms this gel,
Around the
right?
hydrophilic surface, which is the open proteins.
Which is the open proteins, right? And so
Ah, okay.
in our cells, those proteins are the endoskeleton proteins, like I was talking about within the
Hmm.
cytoplasm. The water is obviously the cytoplasm, and so obviously we can't heat our cells to the extent that we heat the Jello. So what's the energy source? And it's ATP.
Sure.
ATP goes in there and it unfolds the proteins, keeping them um, keeping them with the surface area high, so that the cytoplasm can maintain its gel state. And so
Huh.
that's important because for two reasons. One is that these heart cells are relying on ketones and fatty acids, and research consistently shows that if we burn ketones and fatty acids, we get way more ATP from those,
Right.
right?
With
And
glucose. Yes.
right, so if we're in that state and the heart seems to stay in that state by choice, then we have way more ATP available to unfold these proteins, keep them unfolded, so we keep maintain the gel state. But the other aspect of this is that if we don't maintain this gel state, um, maintaining that gel is what. So if people are really into this, they can look at the book also by Gerald Pollack, called "Cells, Gels, and the Engines of Life,"
Hmm.
that explains a lot of this stuff. But anyways, so they want to keep this gel or the cells in this gel state, and if they don't, then we start to lose the charge of the cell. So everybody's heard about the sodium potassium pump, um,
Right.
and how that, distributes these ionic minerals in the cells or outside the cell, so that we get a charge within the cell, and outside the cell, there's a different charge, so that kind of maintains things. Um, but in that book, Cells, Gels, and the Engines of Life, there's a lot of research talked about that kind of calls into question the sodium potassium pump, and whether or not it would even be able to maintain that energy balance. Like, we would require so much ATP to do that, and it's not realistic. Um,
Hmm.
but so earlier, this is probably more than I've talked about in any podcast, more in depth, about this part in the book, because this is kind of hard to understand without the images. But so the gel state, I remember I told you it's exclusion zone water, right? So it
Right. Easy
excludes
water.
things,
Yep.
right? And so I was talking about how there's only some hydrated minerals that can penetrate the water. And if you look at the hydrated minerals that get into the cell, the ones that are kept into the cell to create this, what the sodium potassium pump is supposed to be doing, right? The ones that can get into the fourth phase water are the ones that are kept in high amounts in the cells, maintaining that charge,
Mm.
right? And so the formation of this fourth phase water in the cells is what helps keep those in there to maintain that charge, right?
Yeah.
Uh, and then it excludes the other ones, and that maintains those out here. So we've got different charges on either side, and that keeps, and that charge is important because it's what spaces out the cells in our tissues, right?
Gotcha.
Because if this cell is charged and this cell is charged, they're going to repel each other if they get too close,
Right.
right? So they kind of stay this safe distance away from each other. Okay, and that's what normal tissue feels like when these cells have these normal space between them. However, if we get a breakdown of fourth phase water in our cells, which when you look at cancer, they are amorphous, and they have all these
Mm.
different structural issues in them. Um, when we get that breakdown, we lose the charge, and then we lose the proper spacing, and we get this tissue where the cells are all clumped together, and it feels very hard instead of
Mm.
soft, which sounds to me like a tumor.
Right.
Okay,
Right.
and so the reason the heart is resistant to these things is a few things. One, like I said, it prefers the fatty acids and ketones, which which keeps it, making tons of ATP and away from oxidative phosphorylation. Because if you go into oxidative phosphorylation, you start making less ATP. We get less unfolding of proteins, less formation of structured water, lose the charge. That makes sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. And so if we're, using those fatty acids and ketones, we're making more ATP. We're able to maintain the structure better, um, and then we maintain the spacing, right? But also, um, you need energy to maintain structured water. Like, the water has to hold energy itself, so that it
Right.
can form when it gets next to the proteins. And I don't this I have no, like, direct proof. There's no study that's directly tested this, but I do find it interesting that when they have studied the different electromagnetic fields that come off from different organs of the bodies, the heart has the highest electromagnetic field of any organ in the body. You'd think it'd be the brain because it's this very electrical organ, but
Right.
the heart surpasses it. I can't remember the exact statistics, but they're in the book. I want to say it's 60 times greater than the brain. Um,
Could
and
it be from the
so
mitochondrial density of the heart? Is that
just no, I mean, I don't really know what causes, our bodies to give off electromagnetic field. I don't know if it's from the mitochondria or how we give off that energy,
okay?
but we do, and the heart has the highest one of all of them. So if you're talking about kind of like this self mechanism of the heart to give that energy to the water, and then you're making the ketones that or you're burning the
Sure.
ketones to make the more ATP, to maintain the structure. Like, it just seems like the heart is just like this. It's got all these things about it that discourage cancer from happening. Um,
Gotcha. And it's
so
just source of energy. It's an energy source.
yeah, it's its own energy source pretty much.
That's pretty wild.
Yeah, it's pretty crazy. And again, like, this is all just theories. I'm not sitting here saying, oh, this is exactly what's happening. But
Right.
when I started looking in the research, it's just, this stuff blows my mind. And it also blows my mind um, that the average physician or researcher doesn't know this. that this research, this information is out there. Because imagine how differently researchers would be looking at their research or their experiments if they knew some of these things that have been proven to be going on in the body, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, it just totally throws the context, you know. But
Right.
anyways, so there's that, and then so we go all the way back to we kind of got off on that tangent,
We
which
did,
was a
we did,
great
and I'm
tangent.
sorry, but I appreciate it because it's
Yeah,
like
is
extremely interesting and it opens up another line of thought for a, But please,
yeah,
don't let me interrupt you
yeah,
more. Yeah.
and then so then going back to the other function of the heart,
Hmm.
the one function was the vortexing of it so that it maintains the fourth phase water and the blood can keep flowing. The other function is that um, it's just interesting that the heart is placed right where it is. Um, it's right in between the arteries and the veins, right? And
Hmm.
so if you look at a pressure propulsion pump, it's like it's taking water that's stagnant, like in a reservoir or something, and it's forcefully sucking it in and then forcefully pumping it out somewhere else, like up a hill or something like that,
Mm.
you know. And the heart is kind of placed in the middle of this this fluid that's already flowing. Okay, and so why would it be right there in the middle, right? And so
It's
it's
not at a
more
source, or it's not at
right,
right.
yeah.
Okay.
And so, which to me makes me think that it's treating the fluid, in some way, kind of like,
Ah,
we would pump water through a filter.
right.
The filter's not doing the pumping, but that's coming from somewhere else. The movement of the water is coming from somewhere else, and the heart is the filter's like treating the water. So the heart's like treating the water in a way, and it is. It's kind of vortexing it. But the reason that it's in the middle of that flow, like that, is because if we were to go for a run or start working out really hard or whatever, the tissues would demand more blood for nutrients, right?
Hmm.
Um, and that's largely driven by tissue demand. How fast the blood starts flowing is driven by tissue demand. And and so when that starts to happen, if we went for a run, all of the blood would go over to the arterial side of things where the blood is delivered to the organs and tissues and everything. And that would not be good because if all the blood went over there, the venous side would collapse. And then we'd lose the whole system pretty much. It couldn't function
Mm.
anymore. And so the heart is actually viewed more as a damming up organ or slowing the flow of blood because if it went too fast and went all to the arterial side, we'd lose pressure in the whole system and then we'd die. And if you look at, there's actually some interesting studies they did in like soccer players where when they looked at the heart function during exercise and like how endurance athletes have larger hearts, so they have more developed heart muscle tissue.
Right.
It's not because it's more forcefully pumping blood. It's because it's more efficient at stopping it. And the heart tissue, the muscle tissue is bigger so that it can stop more because it's just always coming in. The
Right.
tissue is always remaining. And so it has to stop it because if it doesn't, again, the veins would collapse with no fluid. And so there was this
Interesting.
yeah, there was this a researcher like in the 1800s. So I don't know how reliable the model that he built is, but he decided that he was going to build a model of the cardiovascular system, a very simple model of it, because you obviously couldn't construct it, especially in the
Right.
1800s,
Right.
something that's to scale or whatever. But he was just trying to, and he had the idea that the heart was a pressure propulsion pump. So he put a pressure propulsion pump here, and he had these tubes that had the consistency of arteries and veins on one side, and then in the middle he had like kind of this spongy material that the fluid could still go through. It's kind of like the capillaries,
Mm.
where the pretty much the blood is just kind of out there. It's just kind of this sloshy, swampy system. Put that there, and then he had another a tube going up that was the consistency of veins. And then he put, fluid that had the consistency of blood in this system, and he started running this pressure propulsion pump. And no matter how hard he tried, he could not maintain the pressure in the venous side with the pressure propulsion pump. So it's because that he had no fourth phase water in there that was moving blood by itself, right? Um,
Right.
he was trying to do it with the heart itself, which he proved was kind of impossible. If the heart was a pressure propulsion pump and we had it in between those things, it could not do it, at least in his model that he created. So very interesting stuff. And so
Wow.
stepping back and like, what does all that mean? It means that Western medicine um, has kind of, I think, misunderstood, what the role of the heart is, um, and how it functions, and what it does for the body. And so, how can you expect to understand some of these diseases of the heart if you don't even understand the role of it in the body,
It's function,
and what it
the way it
does, its
works.
function in the body.
Wow.
And I'm not the only one saying that the heart is a vortex. There's this awesome video called the Helical Heart on YouTube that
Hmm.
was made in like 2000 or 2001 of all these cardiologists sitting there talking about how the heart is a vortex. They don't really know that the blood moves on its own, but um, it's pretty fascinating.
Just looking at the way it moves,
Yeah, they're just
like a
looking at the way
football
it
that you
moves.
said, just like twisting.
Yeah, yeah, and even they even like there's this one guy who started dissecting cow hearts, and he found that if you dissect in a certain way, you can kind of unravel it because the muscle is kind of raveled around itself in this spiral like thing, and it kind of folds up right
Interesting.
there. So that when it contracts, it's just spiraling the whole time. It's
Hmm.
just a really interesting video um, to go watch, but yeah, and so I think the thing to me that that solidifies all this and tells me that it likely is, more along the lines of what's truly happening is the research with infrared saunas and
Hmm.
and heart. So when you look at the research with infrared saunas, it's phenomenal. I don't understand why there's not infrared saunas in every cardiac recovery place in a hospital in the world, based on this research. Because if you think about it, like especially with heart failure, which is when the heart is thought to not be doing its job proficiently, but in reality, it's being forced to be more of a pump than it wants to be. And so instead of having this football shaped end of it, it starts to have this basketball shaped end of it because it starts to expand.
Becomes an enlarged heart, basically.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Because the blood's not flowing well through its on its own, so the heart's having to
Work harder.
kind of get backed up,
Uh-huh.
and so that it starts to grow like that. And so that's all thought to be because the heart stops pumping like it's supposed to, but it was never really supposed to pump in the first place. What's really happening is that the fourth phase water mechanisms are not being kept up well,
Right.
and so
Energized.
then the blood flow suffers, and then the heart suffers, and so
So
then
infrared with the infrared sauna, just not to before we bypass
yeah,
that. So you think the benefit is the light, the infrared light, or the heat, or the combination
it's
of?
the infrared light. So people ask me all the time, what about a regular sauna? And it's like, well, that's beneficial. It's going to help you sweat. It's going to give
Right.
you, hormetic stresses, things like that.
Right.
But it's not infrared light. And so you may be getting some energy from the heat
Uh-huh.
in there, but the infrared light is what's really doing it. And
Because
so
there are those light mechanisms you can get. They're just infrared light. They're not necessarily in a sauna environment,
yeah,
but you can
yeah,
have a stand or hang them on your door and just get close and get that
exactly.
taken. And those are beneficial to the.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. Okay.
And you may want to look into like what wavelength it is, because the closer you can get to 3,000 nanometers is better.
They're closer to it. Okay. So
Yeah,
it's not like a magic number. It's like how close can you get to 3,000
yeah,
nanometers?
yeah. And I don't know
Okay.
that there's a company that makes 3,000. That they may not be aware of that either, but you could get close to it. And even if it's infrared in general, like that's just the most absorbed by light. And um, so yeah, when we
Gotcha.
look at heart failure, and they've done all these studies on people with heart failure and infrared sauna use. And it's just insane what the benefits they get. The injection fraction goes way up. The heart size decreases. It's so, and it makes sense to me because when we take the pressure off the heart to pump by energizing the water in the blood and getting the blood flowing on its own, the heart doesn't have to work as hard and it starts to go back. Um, and and it's amazing. And so also they show that infrared sauna use will increase the nitric oxide produced by the endothelia in your arteries, because it's forming the fourth phase water, which helps protect the arteries. And so now they can do their job better, which is making that nitric oxide.
That's
Um,
huge for all sorts of cardiovascular health. I mean,
yeah,
that's
all
that's
kinds of stuff.
is
Uh,
yeah, that's what we start losing, isn't it?
yeah, yeah. So,
As we get older.
so, so the I guess the pretty, uh, I guess profound results they get in those types of studies are what tells me and kind of confirms that this line of thinking is more along the lines of what's truly going on. There may be some things that are slightly different, but that's kind of what confirms it for me. Is when we actually do things that increase fourth phase water production and take the pressure off the heart responds very, very well.
Wow. And you said
Yeah.
the basics that we can do are sun exposure, grounding, physical touch. I mean, that's
Mhm.
like there's not like a magic pill or food or something that's so
Well, I mean, along the lines of food, I think so. The water in the plants we eat and the water in the meat we eat,
sure.
ideally, is more in this structured phase, this force fed water. So, but we want to eat the freshest food possible because
Right.
I don't know for sure, but I imagine that the longer it's been dead, the least structured it's going to be.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
know,
Less energized. It would have less
yeah,
energy and
exactly.
processed food is like the polar opposite, obviously.
Exactly. There's absolutely no energy in that food. There's not even water in that food.
No. There's a lot of oils, a lot of funny
Exactly.
oils and
Exactly.
grains and sugars, but nothing that's energizing to our blood. So it's something to, I mean, sometimes what we don't put in is just as important as what we do, if not more.
Exactly. Exactly. And so, I guess the moral of the story here is that, health is a lot of times boiled down to diet and exercise. And those are very important, right?
Right.
But we also need to pay attention to the environment that we're in and the energy our body is receiving. I think that's very, very important as we've kind of outlined and discussed here.
Wow. So simple. It's
Mm-hmm.
sun, it's earth, and physical contact.
Yeah, and I think
You
no
know, you
matter what
can't
side
sell
of the
that, right? You wrote the
yeah,
wrong
right,
book. You
and
can't
that's
sell that.
probably why you don't hear much about it is because it's not something that can be patented and sold.
Packaged, or sold
Yeah,
on TV at night. You know,
yeah,
you can't just
yeah,
order your 3 month dose of it.
right. But it
Oh,
makes complete sense to me because no matter which side of the fence you're on, whether you're on the religious side or the evolutionary side, like we evolved in nature. If you're on that side, God put Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, not in a skyscraper in New York.
right.
Uh, so it just makes sense. Like it makes sense that those mechanisms would have been relied on the fact that we were in a natural environment.
Well, if we look at hunter gatherer tribes and the lack of lifestyle disease, and too often we're looking at their macronutrient intake. We're looking at where are they getting their food from? Is it all meat based, animal based with some dairy? Is it, we're looking at these things and we're trying to over isolate the
Mm,
benefit into, like you said, diet and exercise, movement, and what are they eating? And those things are very important. Completely overlooking the fact that they are living and existing and gathering most of what they do within their environment of whether it's sun exposure, contact with the earth, fresh food because they eat it as soon as they kill it in
mm-hmm.
many cases, or right after, or they
Yeah.
gather it and it will spoil, so they eat it
Right.
immediately.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Lots of contact with the earth, obviously, and in a communal,
Mm-hmm.
tribal environment where
Exactly.
they're very much in touch with other people constantly.
Yeah.
Uh, wow, wow.
Pretty cool, huh? It all
That
kind of comes
is,
together and makes sense.
it does. It does. We've been leaving out some crucial elements that we almost taken for granted.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and if I think anybody who's who's paying attention right now could say we should now be, unless you just hate people. I mean, you should be missing those things right now
Yeah.
because they've been removed from a lot of a lot of people's lives right now. Is
Mm-hmm.
that physical contact, being outside, um, and we're germophobic, more covered up than ever,
Mm-hmm.
and killing off any potential bacteria that might be on our body. But the thing is, I mean, wow,
Yeah.
wow, it's simple. It's
Yeah.
really simple.
Yeah. One of the best things I heard is you know who Zach Bush is, Dr. Zach Bush.
Oh, I know, I've heard the name, but I'm not familiar with
Yeah.
them.
He put it kind of he put an interesting spin on it too. Um, So when cells become damaged, and that could be damaged from, say, oxidative stress from free radicals or whatever, or it
Right.
could be damaged so like maybe it breaks down fourth phase water and it can't do cellular functions or whatever. But when water becomes, or when cells become damaged, they lose the ability to communicate to other cells.
Mm.
So they, or they have less of an ability to, and eventually would lose communication altogether. And so they're literally surrounded by other cells like them, but can't communicate with them.
Oh,
And so
wow.
they're kind of socially isolated, right? And so they start to behave in a way. The cell starts to try and function in a way that is very, I would say, selfish because they can't even tell that there's other cells there. And so and it's not that it's like has this consciousness that it's purposely lashing out toward other things, but it starts behaving in a way that's damaging to the cells around it. You know,
Defensive.
yeah,
It's defense
defensive
in a defensive
or
mechanism, I would
yeah,
think.
or like it's secreting these free radicals and oxidative stress to those cells that ends up damaging them as well. And so it's like, what's happening at a cellular level in somebody could actually be representing itself on a community, social, society level. And so we see these people that maybe lash out, maybe their bodies are damaged at a cellular level, and we're seeing the same thing represent itself for the individual human, or in the individual human that's happening, on a cellular level. And that was something that he said that, based on everything that I've looked at, I was just like, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So pretty interesting stuff based on what we're seeing in society today.
Yeah. And with it can only get, I mean, the health, our health can only get worse living this way.
Mm,
But just based on what you've said, the less sun, the less contact with the earth, and the less physical contact we have with other humans, the and let's go with fresh food. Let's talk about a
mm,
dogma that's telling us to eat more packaged food, less meat, more processed, eat fake meat, eat
yeah,
more processed, packaged food or fast food because certain things are closed down or we can't get, markets are shut down, open air markets. It's just, we're heading in the opposite direction of
exactly.
health and supposedly in the name of health.
Mm, yeah, exactly. It's pretty backwards, right?
It's completely
Yeah,
backwards.
and
Yeah.
then you take into context and you take into to account the fact that it is very clear at this point that with this virus or any infection that in the past there is a direct link to poor outcomes with that,
Mm,
and being less healthy, whether it's having a comorbidity or just being
right.
overweight or whatever. The less healthy we are, the worse outcome we're going to have.
Correct.
And then all the things that humans have kind of done over the past year and a half have are things that, like we've talked about, could be leading them down a path toward poor health. And that's not what we need right now. We need people to be aware of the fact that the healthier they are, the more likely they're going to defend themselves successfully from any type of infection.
Absolutely. Yeah. Our immune system has been left out of the mix, but
Yeah.
with not surprising with so many people who are metabolically unhealthy, you
Mm.
know.
Yeah.
But yeah, and so we're seeing the response of physical, the run to medical authority, the run to medical fixes, which are, as you just pointed out, they're second to our immune system. They just don't.
Yeah.
They're trying to fix a disease state, whereas your immune system can prevent a disease state.
Right.
Uh, this is amazing. Wow, this is cool.
Yeah.
Thank you for coming on and sharing this. When's the book release?
It's out now. It was released last week, less than a week
Oh,
ago.
okay.
Yeah, so it's out now.
It's
I wasn't
on.
exactly sure on a date. I didn't know. It was whenever I got everything organized and could put it out there. I just did it. So
So it's on Amazon. How would people find it?
yeah, it's on Amazon. It's in paperback and ebook format. Eventually I'll probably do an audiobook, but I really think that the images are helpful, and it would be hard to get some of the concepts without the images. But I know the audiobook is huge for people, so I probably will eventually do that, but I don't have that yet.
Okay.
But yeah, Amazon. I self-publish, so I don't have a publisher, so I just put it. Amazon's my
Yeah.
only
Welcome
option,
to.
really. Yeah,
That's just how you do it now. Good luck getting a
yeah,
publisher, and they'll just
yeah.
take. If
Really,
you make anything,
yeah,
they'll take it anyway.
yeah. That's right.
Um, well, that's awesome. So, how do people? What's the best way to people to find you? And I know you're practicing chiropractor.
Hmm. Yeah.
in is it North Carolina or Virginia?
Virginia, Virginia.
Virginia.
Yeah, I'm
Okay.
from North Carolina, but Virginia, yeah.
Okay. That's why I heard
Yeah,
that great
so
accent. That's what it is. It's that
yeah,
great North Carolina accent.
yeah, yeah. So I practice chiropractic, and I do functional medicine and like nutrition, metabolic health kind of stuff too. So and
Okay.
yeah, and my website is resourceyourhealth.com.
Resource health.
Um,
Okay.
and then I'm also on social media, less so than I used to be, but I'm on there still.
Gotcha.
And just Dr. Stephen Hussey is my handle for social media.
Yeah, I found you on Instagram. I think we found each other
Yeah,
on Instagram.
yeah, yeah.
So yeah, Dr. Dr. Stephen Hussey on well, that's a PH Stephen.
PH, yeah.
PH Stephen. Okay, well, great. Thank you for coming back. I'm gonna make sure that these notes, as much as I can contain in the show notes, and get your links in the show notes so people can reach out and find you and find the book. I'll try to link to it on Amazon as well, so people can find it. But wow, wow, this is an aspect that has been not only, I mean, not just neglected, but overlooked by researchers.
Yeah,
That really, like you said, they should know better. Um, but likely because you can't package it. How do you sell sunlight?
exactly.
You
Yeah,
know,
yeah,
or human touch or contact with the earth, and it's just kind of telling
hmm,
that the reason there hasn't been more research in that direction is because there isn't a, a profit on the other end of that research.
yeah,
Who's going to
exactly.
fund it?
Yeah, and as an example, just kind of end here that I used to work more or less across the street from Virginia Tech
Oh,
School of Medicine and Research, medical
hmm,
research, or whatever. And so I treated a lot of students and researchers and professors and things from there. And I would always ask them what they're working on, and every single time they would tell me, "I'm working on this very small cellular process to see if we can make a drug to affect it." And it was
right.
just like, they otherwise they wouldn't be doing the research. They wouldn't
They
be
wouldn't have
looking
the
at that.
funding.
Yeah, they wouldn't have the funding, right? Exactly. And so
Yeah,
that's why these types of ideas maybe not be as well known because you can't market them. You can't. I mean, I guess
can't
maybe you
petition for
could.
the funding to a large corporation to get
Yeah, yeah.
results,
They'd be like, well,
basically.
that doesn't matter. We want to see how we can affect some biochemical pathway so we can sell a drug for it.
Right.
Yeah. Hmm.
Wow. And we just need sunlight, dirt, and people,
Yeah,
and
exactly.
and a good diet.
Yeah, yeah,
Wow.
exactly.
Awesome. Well, thanks again. I look forward to for this to get out there and let people listen and the questions that'll come back from it, because I think this is again untouched, not spoken about enough. Um, and I'm looking forward to what's next. Now you've been working on this book for a while.
Yeah, I have no idea what's next. Right now, it's just I
Get
probably
this
take a
book
little,
out.
probably take a little break and promote this book a little bit.
Enjoy,
Yeah,
enjoy.
yeah.
Yeah, great. Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. Have a great week.
You too.